It calms me down. Shut up. Greetings. The theologian William Jones opines in his introduction of his work, Is God White Racist?, a preamble to black theology, with the breaking of what he calls the 11th commandment. He says, and I quote, "Thou shalt not ignore the basic tenets of Judeo-Christianity. To do so would be merely to establish a folk religion, which would not survive the test of history, and the black man will have lost the God who had brought him over so many difficult places in the past." However, this is the path Jones does ultimately decide to go down. It is my contention that Jones utilizes his theological abilities to highlight the oppressive properties of a theism where God determines all of human history. But he seeks to replace it with, although it can be characterized as a folk religion, it would be deflationary. He replaces it with a theism that is able to sum up and help push the cause of black liberation while taking in the psychological needs of those who are oppressed. The multi-evidential quality of suffering is the first thing I want to go down. It's very key to his main argument. In order to illustrate it, I want to present a traditional problem in philosophy of solipsism. We have a proposition. Everything we know of can be characterized with our experiences in the past. And there are two theses which can explain it. One, there is an external world, which we all observe, and all know of other people, and we interact with it every day. This is the common sense approach we all seem to take. But the solipsist would respond by saying that all of reality is an illusion of your mind. You are the only mind that exists, and you are the world itself. There are no other minds, no other objects, but everything is just illustrative of your own imagination. Jones presents us with a similar problem. By the way, the problem of solipsism has driven some philosophy students crazy. There's one story of one student who, of course, is up all night opining this very question. He asks his professor, who then responds to him by saying, "Well, if you really want to find out this problem, I just need to know one important thing. Who wants to know?" But unfortunately, the multi-evidential quality of suffering is not really a problem you could slide away with a joke. We have a proposition that theologians seem to take, which is God is the determining force behind human history. His providence guides all of it. And there are two theses to explain that in doing so, one aspect that he has guided is also the disproportionate suffering of African Americans. Either it is a cause of God's divine favor or his disfavor. To illustrate, I quote from the book of Samuel, chapter 15, verses 1-5. "Samuel also said unto Saul, The Lord hath sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice and the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all those they have, and spare them not, but slay both men and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." And Saul gathered the people together, and numbered them in Telem, 2,000 footmen, and 10,000 men of Judah. It goes on. "And Saul came to a city of Amalek, and laid in wait in the valley. And Saul said unto Canaanites, Go and depart, and get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them." God shows favor to one tribe, and disfavor to another. And this brings up to the next important point. God as the sum of his actions. This is a principle that is adopted from French existentialists, especially Jean-Paul Sartre, but also to a lesser extent Albert Camus. We do not know God's essence in and of itself. We do not know what God is, except through the fact of his actions within creation. That is how we can judge the properties of God. We do not know God's essence in and of itself, but his essence only precedes his existence. For Sartre, his main principle is existence precedes essence. That is, we don't know what something is until we know that it is. But once we know that it is, that it exists, then we can attribute properties, because being, what something is in its actions and its effects. And because of this prevents us from presupposing certain properties about God, that he is omnibenevolent. but rather we have to derive them from the actions itself. And this brings us next to a dastardly dilemma. There are two options. If black suffering is a result of divine favor, blacks must take to quietism. However, if black suffering is a result of disfavor, God is a divine racist. Both of these propositions are detrimental to the cause of black theology. According to the black theologian Dwight Hopkins, black theology is an interplay between the pain and oppression and the promise of liberation found in the Bible on one hand, and a similar existence experienced by African Americans and poor people today. First horn of the dilemma, quietism. Quietism is the attitude of people who say, others can do what I cannot do. To quote Jean-Paul Sartre in his work, existentialism is a humanism. If suffering is indeed a sign of divine favor, why would one reject it? To do so would be to reject what God wants of you. The principal character that is used by Jones to illustrate this is Albert Camus' Father Fenelon in his play The Plague. Father Fenelon deals with the plague and its devastation amongst the people of Europe. He comes up with two theodicies, but the second theodicy is the one I want to focus on. If his theodicy can be characterized as a sacred duty to God, and that suffering brings out something even grander, then why should we protest? Why should we protest it? Why should we try to abolish it? It's a sign of God's favor. After all, do we not have a sacred duty to it? This is explored in the question, can a Christian call a doctor? If indeed a doctor is someone who negates diseases, and God is giving you these diseases for some greater benefit, is this not the rejection of God's will? And of course, Jones takes the same principle and applies it to his interlocutors. This is the first horn of the dilemma. But the second horn is the namesake of the book, which is God being a divine racist if it is a fact of disfavor. Jones lists 5 propositions which entails racism. First of all, humanity has to be divided into at least 2 groups, one of which gets to suffer and one of which gets to oppress. This leads to a hierarchy of superiority. Being a member of the group that is doing the oppressing means that you suffer less loss than all the other groups into consideration. You are favored. And of course, God is responsible for this disproportion because he's the one guiding human history. And his preference is held along ethnic and racial lines. And God is also a member of the in-group. He identifies himself to those he is giving favor and rejects those he is giving disfavor to. And if he is indeed giving disfavor onto blacks and electing whites, then it's not that hard to see why anyone would call God a divine racist. The first interlocutor that is going to be dealt with is Benjamin Washington. His response is that by taking up suffering, God has chosen African Americans to be a suffering servant. Their job is to suffer. It's to bring about some kind of redemption. This way, God avoids the charge of divine racism, but unfortunately falls into the first horn of quietism. In fact, even Jones refers to this as the worst of the theodicies being given. First of all, the theodicy of deserved punishment is not dispelled, because as the suffering servant, you do deserve to suffer. It's in the namesake. But furthermore, he doesn't even present knowledge to how he knows this. This could be, for all we know, another example of an ad hoc attempt at salvaging God's character. There's no distinction being drawn between redemptive and non-redemptive suffering. Suffering that is going to be for nothing, and suffering that is going to lead to something else. In fact, why does God even need the suffering servant if he's all-powerful? Is he not just pushing blacks to do his own dirty work? And if it is the case of divine favor, and there is some kind of positive quality to it, this does lead to quietism because who's anyone to reject the role that God gives to you? Such would be rebellion. Jesus Christ himself, who every Christian is supposed to be an example of, suffers, and who are you to reject the call of Jesus? So this leads to a facet of problems for black theology. the next person is Joseph Washington. The purposes that blacks are elected as suffering servants is rejected on this other theodicy. But rather, what does end up happening is blacks are rather chosen because they suffer. God identifies with the oppressed, like in ancient Israel. If this is the case though, then there's a few problems. Just because God identified with Israel does not mean he identifies with the blacks. And if that is the case, then it seems to be an unwarranted jump. And even historically, God had to call the Jews onto their role. But is there such a parallel to be found with African Americans? So this theodicy also fails. No, it appears I mixed up Cone with Washington. I figured I had to move forward one more, just to move ahead to Albert Cleage. Albert Cleage does accept the second horn of the dilemma. For him, blacks do deserve their punishment. But what he negates is that it doesn't follow God is a racist. What he does consider is that anybody who does cow down to the oppressor does deserve suffering, not because that they are black, but because they cow down to the oppressor. So here, what Cleage decides to do is segregate God's connection to the oppressor and show it for objective third-party reasons, that nobody should cow down to an oppressor. Unfortunately, this also leads to quietism. For, think about it as such. If African Americans are indeed receiving due punishment for what's going on, then we run into a problem. Has there been recompense? For every noble African American who has stood up to the oppressor, there have been dozens who cowed down to their oppressor and obeyed. How do we know the proportions are in order and that African Americans still don't deserve to suffer? Furthermore, if Albert Cleage is trying to identify blacks with what he refers to as a soul brother, somebody who is trying to lead to empowerment, then there's a problem. That doesn't make God black, that could just make him an Oreo. An Oreo is somebody who is black on the outside, white on the inside. Or one could also imagine that God does show divine disfavor to blacks, but also on top of other purposes as well. So that uncertainty also still presents itself there. The next theologian, Major Jones, tries to lower down some of the qualities we attribute to God. God is not all-powerful. In fact, he needs co-sufferers. He needs blacks to suffer along with him. But the problem with that is it's ad hoc. Why is he picking certain properties but not others? Why omnipotence, for example, as opposed to omnibenevolence? It appears that he's just selecting the attributes he likes. And God could still be a divine racist. For consider, what does God's impotence have to do with his attitude? And the last theologian to look at is J.D. Roberts. And J.D. Roberts proposes that the authentic theology is both psychologically beneficial to the oppressed, and God is not a divine racist. God identifies with the oppressed. It needs to be a presupposition. But so this would directly come into contradiction with we only know God through our actions, but rather we can know God through our presuppositions as well. But this leads to a contradiction as well. For example, in the two presuppositions, they can contradict one another. For the example that's being given by Jones is pie in the sky eschatology. Pie in the sky eschatology is putting off rebellion and just delving into the fact that God's justice is going to fix everything at the end times. But this is psychologically beneficial. And at the same time, it clashes immensely with the notion of God being a divine racist. And it does still affect black theology. So what ends up happening is Jones concludes that none of these theodicies are satisfactory, and the problem still lingers. But he provides his own solution, which is what I mainly wish to discuss. The solution is humanocentric theism. Humanocentric theism is the notion that God creates, but he does not guide human history. He doesn't determine it with providence, but allows humans to make up their own purposes. Blacks are free to define themselves, their own outcomes and liberations. And this is a framework that accommodates human freedom and human self-determination. It prevents the problem of divine racism, in fact. For God no longer has any interest in one group over another, but leaves humans to themselves. And the most important thing is, it's very flourishing to liberation. It prevents racists from utilizing theistic doctrines for the purposes of oppression. These benefits allow for Jones to have a God that lets him take his people and decide their own fate in their own hands, and prevents the oppressors from utilizing his religion against him, and does not relate God to the position of a racist. So with all this in mind, why not go down this position? And what's really amazing about this position is lived religion not only becomes a way to describe it, to describe theology, but it's prescriptive for theology. As theology goes on and blacks augment their own decisions to fit the society they're in, and the new realm of destiny they want to take in any new social context, then it could frame and work to fit that. Humanocentric theism allows God to stay in the picture, but it allows him to stay in the picture insofar as it allows hope to be in the hands of black people themselves, which makes for a really good rectification, all in all. The main reason I want to discuss Jones is not for its theological abilities and his theological capability of challenging his interlocutors. While he does do a good job as far as I can see it, as a religious studies major, the thing I do want to focus on is religious studies guiding, theology guiding religious studies insofar as there's self-awareness within it. There's self-awareness in theology wherein categories of the past can affect outcomes of the present. And theology being a self-forming guide, I understand, at least as Jones so far sees it, allows theology to dispel itself of its past essentialist categories. And I think really that's the amazing thing. Quietism, as it so far exists, is a reflection of personal psychology and an understanding of what a community needs. I propose that what Jones is doing is taking that psychological need and using theological tools as a way of liberating black theology from its essentialist past, its categories, what it needs to be. And he breaks the 11th commandment as he so sees it, because it is a commandment worth breaking. Now, whether one finds the argument persuasive or not is something completely different in itself. I myself do not. But what is really amazing is the capability of theologians to use the categories as a way of self-reflection and as a way to understand their own theology and eliminate it of its more oppressive qualities. And with that, I wish to stop and ask for questions 2 minutes early. And I thank you all for your time. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the contribution it makes to theology, and I recognize you take an atheological approach to this, but I was wondering what you had any comments on its value in religious studies, as opposed to just being a religious studies discourse that's related to theology. How does this advance the discourse within religious studies?
Within religious studies, there has been kind of a notion of religion not being recognized any longer as being some trans-historical essence, but rather something that's self-forming and self-developing. If we look at theology as it exists in its own discourse as being prescriptive and forming, then we can actually see some kind of self-awareness and a dispelling of its own past categories. And I think it's really helpful for us to analyze it because theologians are academics in that they use tools to obtain new knowledge and new inquiry. And I think if this is a live example of this happening, where past essentialist categories are causing oppression being eliminated, I think it is worth studying in that paradigm. No longer as kind of religion being a list of essential dogmatic elements, but something more necessary for the psychological needs of its participants.
You're saying the discourse and religious studies can contribute to having theological effects that make social patterns better?
By analyzing theological effects that make social realities better.
was wondering what made you include the concept of the Oreo. It just didn't seem to be a good part of your scholar. It seemed to be a weakness in scholarly discourse. Like, so I was wondering what made it meaningful for you and what made you bring it to the as part of your presentation.
Well, granted, it is a very colloquial word, and of course, it doesn't signify, and it does signify kind of a negative quality to it. But this is a word that Jones himself uses, and of course, sometimes that kind of breaks through with regards to who you're analyzing. I didn't really have a better term for it, and I thought that the more guttural word kind of brings into the seriousness of race.
Okay, thank you. Mine's a little bit of a potentially stupid question, but what do you mean by horn when you're using the first horn and the second horn? Is that like a term?
Oh, it is a term for dilemmas. Usually,
okay.
Yeah, because it's kind of like a bull approaching you. If it hits you with one horn, it's going to be fatal.
Okay. I just had like no idea. I was like, I don't know what that means.
To any dilemma, it's just two options. None of them are too convincing or too helpful. So you have to kind of either break the horns, just find a third option, or you have to let one of them hit you and then just mitigate the pain. It's good for analogy's sake. Yes, Bill?
Okay, so just so I understand what you're trying to do, you're just trying to survey all these stances that Steve is going over in his book and not trying to make your own judgments on it or anything?
I'm not trying to make my own judgments.
Okay.
I let those arguments stand or fall as they may. Like I said, I don't accept them, but I didn't go on to deconstruct them or to critique them. I'm just going on to show how the theologian is operating, and also I'm going to show how he doesn't think that they fulfill the needs of this community, and that they do take black theology into a negative bent. His answer isn't we have to abandon black theology to keep the tenets. His conclusion is we have to decline the tenets to keep black theology.
Where do you see some of this discourse evolving at some point in the future? Would it be leading towards, like a simple question, where you're chronicling a lot of these different positions that are being established over time? Just curious, where do you see that it will eventually go later on?
I think where it's going to go is accepting skepticism as a way of diffusing bad notions of theism and keeping good notions of theism, or notions of theism that are conducive towards liberation. This way we have theologies that are much more reflective of the needs of the people, as opposed to fitting the needs of the people to go around the theology.
What's the difference between the human-centered theologism and different than the secular way of human-centered understanding of values?
Well, Jones actually does a pretty good job at kind of comparing the two, and he thinks that what's going on is that they're kind of like cousins. Secular humanism and humanocentric theism, while they have a difference in opinion with whether or not God exists, what they have in common is they want to make humans the authorities of their own destiny. But with God, what he goes on to argue is you have kind of a role or path that best reflects the black experience of the community, and allows for a cosmic narrative as a way of exemplifying this.
I want to follow up on Frederick's question, actually. I'm not clear about his understanding of God, so just if you could explain it again to me, because it zipped past me. What I heard you say was that his solution was to say that God created people and then he just essentially disconnected from humanity. So people are just people and they're abusing each other or liberating themselves, but with no necessary connection to God. Is that the point, or did I misunderstand what you were saying?
It might have been how it came across, but in terms of what's going on is God just separates himself from humanity so that they may decide their own fates and future, so that they may make their own meanings in life, rather than God taking his own meaning and exerting it onto humans that they ought to follow. So humans get to decide their own meanings, ideas, what causes they want to fight for, their goal for liberation, that sort of thing.
It's an incredible move then, because in a way it's dealing with the standard theodicy questions of what explains evil, and it seems to be essentially saying, it's all around us. God's not responsible at all for any of this, although he's got all his power and all his benevolence, but really it's all. So I wonder why one even needs a God. So why not go that extra step and just say, because you don't really, he doesn't function in any kind of useful way for humans if he's disconnected. And so I'm trying to think, why keep God in that equation? Is it simply because he can't imagine a world without God? Like, what's the usefulness of a God in his view?
All right. Well, one of his biggest inspirations for this move is actually Holocaust theology. Holocaust theology is various members of the Jewish community trying to rationalize and understand Judaism in light of the Holocaust, this huge, immense tragedy that happened and befell upon them. And one of the justifications for the Jewish people, well, at least according to one scholar, was that secular humanism can't really capture the experience of the Jewish community. They're not like any other atheist who comes from a Gentile background. They have their own experience, and they really need a narrative and understanding that best reflects them. So with Jones, I think what's going on is pretty much the same thing. What's being expressed here is kind of a way of garnering liberation, cooperation, using a theology as kind of a narrative so that ideas of liberation can move forward. It's a narrative that best exemplifies the experience of the Black community themselves. I think that's why he's going down that position.
I did a paper on genocide and the Holocaust, and psychological ways that people dealt with it, and there's a case study where a group of Jewish scholars were in a death camp, and they held God on trial, and they found him guilty, but then they went back to praying for him. Anyways, I found that really interesting. It was just kind of they held him accountable, but then they let it go.
People have weird ways of dealing with evil. There's a story that's spoken by the philosopher Peter Kreeft, who's a logician down at Boston College. He has a story of two Jews in the concentration camp. One says, God will save us from this. He's a very orthodox and religious Jew, and the secular humanist Jew who says, God's not coming, don't fall for that, we're just going to die. And they're going into the gas chamber, and the religious Jew, before he steps in, says, God's not coming for me, I give up. And he goes in declaring an atheism. Whereas the secular Jew goes in, but before he does, he says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, which is the Shema. If any of you are familiar with Judaism, it's the declaration of monotheism that goes back to Moses. So evil has a weird way of working itself in the psychology of people. There are plenty of people who give up God through suffering, but there are other stories, famously C.S. Lewis, who opines on the evil he experienced during the Great War, World War I, and he reflects on it and he thinks, that's evil, but what makes something evil? And then the only thing he can rationalize that grounds morality is God's existence itself. So in reflecting and opining on the evil he suffered and the suffering that was felt during the Great War, what makes it terrible? He came to God as his conclusion. So the reasoning skills of various people differs. I guess suffering brings up different axioms and different mindsets.
To answer the question whether or not God is a white racist, you only followed up Jones' statement?
Are you asking me if I agree with Jones?
Yeah, you just to answer the question that whether or not the God is a white racist. So to answer this question, you only follow the Jones' statement?
I think that there are other ways around it. I don't think you have to subscribe to Jones's humanocentric theism, but that's a theological one I just didn't really feel was worth discussing. Anything else?
We are talking about contradiction and dilemmas. What are they? Not very clear to me. If whether God is writing a fate or people are writing fates for them. how much power is plays role in the field?
So a contradiction is when something has mutually exclusive properties. A famous idea of a contradiction is a squared circle, because you're saying that there's a shape that has 4 corners while simultaneously having no corners. And that leads to absurdity and meaninglessness. And a dilemma is when somebody presents you with an argument and there's 2 ways out of it, but neither of the options are palatable. Lastly, with regards to the final part of your question, God guiding fate is, just answer really quickly, there are various ideas of how God and history unfold and relate to one another, but under most models where God is kind of coordinating that, it does seem to fall right, just on first glance.
Has more power.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.